Richard Kuklinski, April 11, 1935, March 5, 2006, known by the chilling name, the Iceman, is one of the most notorious and enigmatic contract killers in 20th century America. While only convicted for 5 murders, he admitted to neutralizing over 100 victims during his 30 years entrenched in the dark underworld of the Mafia. Some people are born to love. Others are molded by pain, fear, vice, and violence into something that the world later calls a monster. Kuklinski is a complete product of such molding. The path to becoming a Mafia hitman. In the early 1950s, Richard became involved with the Mafia, not out of ambition, but due to debt and violence. He owed Roy DeMeo, a ruthless gangster from the Gambino family. When Roy sent his men to intimidate him, Richard stood his ground without flinching. No fear, no pleading. His emotional indifference caught Roy's attention. Once he cleared his debt, Richard was pulled deeper into the shadows, a world where only those without fear of death survive. Inside the syndicate, Richard quickly became a perfect tool. Engaging in illegal pornography trade, organizing thefts, collecting debts, enforcing discipline through brutal violence. His capacity to handle situations others would freeze in terror made him both revered and feared. Gradually, his name reached the DeCavalcante family, where they first hired him to carry out an elimination. But what was most frightening about Richard wasn't just that he killed on command. It was his drive to seek out victims himself, to satisfy an internal thirst for violence. Starting in 1954, Richard would drive from New Jersey to Manhattan, prowling the Upper West Side to find someone who irked him, or more simply, someone he chose randomly. His only rule? Never eliminate women or children. Everyone else was fair game. Even in the cold-blooded world of crime, his peers whispered of him with one term: a true demon. The mind of a hitman. How Richard saw his victims. Richard never saw his victims as people, but neither did he view them as mere lifeless corpses. In the final moments that most people would never witness, Richard saw something else. The truth that people have spent their entire lives hiding. Some of them looked at him with desperation. Some begged as though there was something left to hold on to. But what stuck with Richard the most wasn't the fear in their eyes. It was the loneliness. He had always thought himself to be the loneliest person in the world. But when those terrified eyes gazed up at him, wet, trembling, completely exposed, he realized that loneliness was far more common than most people realized. In that instant, he saw the fragments of lives that would never be told. The regrets, the broken sorrows, the things they would never admit. Without words, without time, just a fleeting glance before darkness descended. And strangely, each time, Richard felt as though he was looking at himself. Not the cold-hearted killer that the press painted him as, not the sociopath people expected him to be, but that child from years ago who longed for someone to see him, to understand him, before everything went awry. The victims never knew he was sad. No one did. A hitman had no right to be sad, but Richard knew better than anyone. A person truly lives only when they face the end, and that was the one moment he ever felt not alone. Childhood, the breaking of a soul. Before becoming the Iceman, Richard was once a child. But that was the only thing about his childhood that resembled a normal life. The Kuklinski household was one where violence was the only language spoken. His father, Stanley Kuklinski, a raging alcoholic, was violent to a degree that arguments always ended with blood. He would beat his children so severely that Richard was often struck with a metal rod or thrown into the basement for hours without food. Once, in a fit of rage, Stanley killed his own son, Richard's brother Florian, when he was just 7 years old. The family was forced to lie to the police, claiming Florian had fallen down the stairs. It was the first time Richard realized the truth wasn't as important as the fear. His mother, Anna McNally, offered no protection. Instead, she perpetuated the cycle of violence, using anything in the house, broomsticks, belts, anything that could cause pain. Richard grew up in a home where love was never present. Bullying. The moment he realized he had to become a monster. Small, damaged, Richard became the target of neighborhood bullies. His accumulated fear over time transformed into something else: animal torture. At the age of 10, Richard began torturing dogs and cats. It wasn't out of innate malice, but because for the first time in his life he felt powerful. He tied two cats' tails together and threw them across a clothesline. He dropped a dog from the roof to the ground. No one stopped him. No one cared. No one told him it was wrong. The first elimination. Around the age of 13 or 14, after years of being bullied by a group of teenagers, Richard ambushed and ended the life of their leader, Charlie Lane, using a wooden stick. He then took the victim's fingers and teeth, ensuring there would be no way to identify him. In that moment, Richard didn't feel fear. He didn't cry. He didn't shake. He only thought, from now on, I will be the one who makes others hurt, not the one who gets beaten. That was the moment Richard Kuklinski ceased being a child and became what the world would later call the Iceman. Family, and the mask of a monster. Two personalities of Richie, good Richie and bad Richie. Richard Kuklinski grew up in a house where love didn't exist, where the sound of footsteps on the stairs was more terrifying than yelling. A child beaten so severely that they could no longer cry would have to create their own world to survive. And in that darkness, two Richies were born. Good Richie, the mask of one who wants to be loved. Good Richie is the weaker side, the part that still believes that one day the family could be better. As an adult, Good Richie became the perfect mask that Richard hid behind, a carefully constructed facade that deceived even those closest to him. To the neighbors, teachers, and friends of his children, Richard was the ideal man, kind-hearted, warm, and responsible. They saw a hardworking man who told his wife he worked as a currency trader or was a director at a Disney animation studio. A generous father who bought expensive gifts, threw lavish birthday parties, and took his family to Disney World and Europe like the perfect family. A kind-hearted citizen who once dressed as Santa to visit sick children in hospitals. A man who never physically harmed his children, a rarity that made his wife think, he's just hot-tempered, but not evil. Good Richie created the life Richard had always wished he had. A happy family, a loving wife, 3 healthy children, and a beautiful house in New Jersey. A world without shouting, without belts, without basements, without blood. But that was just a dream of the child who survived the past. Bad Richie, the darkness behind the door. Bad Richie is the survival instinct, an entity born from pain to protect Richard by making him scarier than anyone who ever hurt him. On the outside, Good Richie smiles, but when the door closes, Bad Richie comes to life. He tortured his wife with beatings so severe they left her ribs fractured. He controlled his children with his silence and gaze, planting a nameless terror into them. He imposed military-like rules, punishing even the smallest mistakes in ways so cruel his children never dared ask questions. He mentally abused the family, keeping them in a constant state of anxiety. Bad Richie never targeted his children with his fists, but he destroyed their childhood with his presence, with the fear that they might breathe wrongly in front of him. Bad Richie was the darkness that Good Richie could never fully hide. Two faces, a life with 2 layers. Richard Kuklinski's family life was a toxic blend of a man the outside world saw as good and kind, a monster his family had to endure in silence. Good Richie created a beautiful home, but Bad Richie turned it into a prison. Good Richie took his children out, but Bad Richie made them tremble whenever his car stopped at their doorstep. Good Richie bought his wife necklaces, but Bad Richie used the same hand, adorned with a wedding ring, to choke her. No one in the family knew the truth. The man before them had more than 2 personalities. He had a third face, the darkest and coldest. The final moments of Richard Kuklinski, and the one confession that smells of regret. In March 2006, at Trenton State Hospital, New Jersey, Richard Kuklinski lay in bed, his body decaying from heart disease and other complications. At 70, a long life for a hitman who had lived a lifetime of violence. No more gangsters, no more victims, no more Bad Richie, no more the Iceman. Just an old man gasping, bound by his own body. His wife, Barbara, stood there, the woman who had lived a life of fear and warped love with him. In those final days, Richard still kept his emotions sealed, as he had for 70 years. But there was one rare moment, something that many later accounts would record. The moment the mask fell. Barbara recalls that when the doctors asked if she would consent to disconnecting Richard's life support, she replied, "No." When she returned to the room, Richard asked her, "Did you sign it? Did you let them turn off the machine for me to die?" Barbara answered, "No, I didn't." Richard simply replied, "You should have signed it." It wasn't a plea. It wasn't a reproach. It sounded like the words of a man who wanted to die, as if he were tired of the personalities he had lived with, of the violence, the secrets, and the monster in his head. Then, Richard turned away and never spoke to Barbara again. 4 days later, he passed away. Silently, without struggle, without panic, without a final confession. Just like the death of a machine that had run for too long, finally coming to a stop. Did he regret it? The answer is as cold as his nickname, the Iceman. To understand Richard Kuklinski's emotions in his final moments, remember that he lacked empathy, sociopath. He ended lives without a heartbeat skipping. He never cried while recounting his murders. But he cried when speaking of the dog he killed in his childhood. In his final interviews, when asked, "Do you regret anything?" Richard replied, "I regret letting myself become this. Not regretful for the lives he took, not regretful for terrorizing his family, not regretful for ruining his children's childhood. He regretted not being able to escape the monster that his childhood had created. It was a strange kind of regret, one that only those with psychological disorders experience. Regret over losing control of himself, not for the harm he caused others. But even so, in a few rare moments, the human part of him would show. When asked about his family, Richard said, "I loved them, and I wish I had been a better person." It was the first time, and the last time, that good Richie showed up on the face of the Iceman. The most important truth. Richard Kuklinski did not die as a fully regretful man. He died as someone who understood his life was a mistake, wanted to escape the monster inside, but could never become the person he wanted to be. Perhaps the only regret he had was he could never be good Richie longer.